Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of GARBAudiobooks, where we read the trashiest literature throughout time and space to you in audiobook format. Today, we are beginning the tale of Count Dracula's Canadian Affair, written by Otto, Frederick, and published by Patent Press in the year 1960. Let us begin. To 9 working women whose confidence, courage, foresight, and sacrifice made the publication of this novel possible. Chapter 1. Lagonda Falls was a small settlement, much like any of the others fringing the Canadian wilderness. The main street boasted a saloon, a blacksmith shop, 2 general stores, and half a dozen weather-beaten cabins. There was little movement on the streets. Only a dozen horses were tied to the hitching post in front of the saloon. 7 of those had no saddles. 3 were badly fed Indian ponies. 2 wagons were standing outside the blacksmith shop. The driver stood near the huge forge, watching the smithy work. "How much longer do you reckon it'll take, Uncle Clem?" The older man hesitated a moment, letting his eyes wander in the direction of the general store on the opposite side of the street. "About as long as it'll take you to fetch Mary from over yonder," he replied. "That's good. I'll go over and get Mary right now so that we can be on our way." Uncle Clem walked over to the second wagon, which was drawn by oxen, and pretended to secure the assortment of farm tools. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched the younger man cross the street and paused to have a second look at the Indian ponies. Inside of the general store, Mary carefully counted out a few coins, making sure the thin packet of money was safe in the inner pocket of her coat. She felt a strong sense of responsibility in adding to these extras to their stock of food, which would have to last for several months. While the frontier storekeeper stacked up her frugal order of brown sugar and a small amount of bacon, she curiously regarded the 2 men who were loitering at the other end of the counter. She had seen many like them since entering the Canadian woods. Their high boots and heavy belted jackets made them look typical of the region. With no thought of listening to their conversation, she suddenly stiffened to attention at the sound of a familiar name. Her deep pocket bonnet concealed the interest that crept into her eyes. "Lake Elysian?" one of the men queried. "I went through that section about a month back. Good timber there, but snags of underbrush to be scraped first." Mary moved a step nearer under the pretext of examining an open box of dried prunes. "Here it's been opened up for settlers," the other man remarked idly. The first man leaned back across the counter, sent a cloud of blue smoke pouring from his pipe towards the ceiling along with his warm laughter. "Settlers won't get such a warm welcome that way." Mary's fingers locked tightly in her woolen mitts. She tilted the large frame of her bonnet in an effort to catch their next words. "No," the man continues, "the Indians are quiet enough since the Battle of New Ulm. Most of them are gone. Moved on further west." He paused to knock dead ashes from his pipe. "It's that outfit near the head of the lake. Canucks. Been around there for years. Afraid of losing their free trapping grounds. Cleared woods means an end to their traffic. But that's not all. There's this strange count." The door swung open and the tall man who had been with Uncle Clem walked into the store. Closing the door, he moved swiftly to Mary's side and gathered her parcels from the counter. "All ready, sis? Then let's go." He led the way to the door without waiting for her reply. Mary followed him. Outside the store, she managed to tug at his arm. "Wait a minute, Ralph. I want to tell you something." "Not now, sis," he replied, leading the way across the wheel-rutted clearing that served as Lagonda Falls' main street. The blacksmith in his black leather apron had been giving a final test to the bolts and braces, scrutinizing the rims of the wheels and inspecting the heavy straps of the harness. He patted the smooth flank of the horse nearest him, speaking to the man on the high seat. "Some team you got there, stranger. Don't see their like often in these woods," he offered appreciatively. Reckon they'll do, the driver drawled sociably. Course, we depend on the oxen for the hard work. Mary's full skirt swung free from the great wheel as she climbed up to the second seat beneath the canvas shelter, stowing away her purchases for safe keeping. The man on the high seat pushed back the wide-brimmed hat, then let his hand caress his whiskered face thoughtfully. Bought out the place, I see. Well, it's the last store we'll see for a long while. Now we're really going into the woods. Y'all ain't scared, are you, young'un? Mary looked up into the laughing blue eyes. Of course not, Uncle Clem. Why should I be afraid? There's only one thing. Not now, honey. We've got to be getting along. Our next camping spot is a considerable spell away. He drew the reins taut, spoke a word of command to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward. Mary was obliged to subside into silence, her curiosity and concern unsatisfied. The rumble of the wagon and the clopping of the horses' feet mingled with the few words she'd heard from the store, beating a steady rhythm in her mind. Settlers not welcome. Settlers not welcome. Weeks ago, Peter and Nancy Swallow had watched their children, Mary and Ralph, set out on the long, hazardous journey into the lands beyond Mississippi. Mary had felt delightfully grown up and important, standing beside Uncle Clem and Ralph when the decision had been reached. Only a year ago, her father had returned from his long mission in the South. Her eyes shed tears at the thought of her father's homecoming, leaning on a heavy crutch for support. He had been furloughed home a month before the close of the Mexican War because of a badly splintered leg bone. Under the expert care of Dr. Allen, Peter's leg was healing. The family was happy simply in being together again. Peter found it difficult to content himself with this happiness. Their 5 acres of farmland offered scant security to his growing family. Then came the offer from the government. Free land in the north to return soldiers. It appeared to be a promising opportunity to build a home with safe assurance for the future, since the soil in the Canadian woods was believed to be rich and productive once the land was cleared. Dr. Allen had vetoed Peter's plans. He would promise to save the leg, but Peter must remain close by where the leg could be treated regularly. It was Ralph who first thought of a solution. Ralph, grown tall with brown eyes like his father's. I'll go out alone and take them claims in Dad's name, he announced, standing before the open fire. Before the family could recover from their surprise, Uncle Clem voiced his approval. Good idea, son, and I'll go with you. But how could you two get along? No woman to cook or do for you? Nancy gasped. Like a small whirlwind of full skirts and bright hair, Mary jumped up eagerly from her stool by the fireplace, where she was putting stitches in a quilt block. That'll be my share. I'm going to be their cook. After the first protests had been overridden, one by one, the idea took root. It was Nancy who first capitulated. Mary is a capable cook, and Ralph did all the work in our fields while you were away, she reminded her husband. Uncle Clem can furnish the older head, which they'll need, she concluded. So it had finally been arranged. Necessary supplies to last several months were placed in the covered wagon, and the precious farm equipment was loaded into the open wagon, which was to be drawn by the yoke of oxen. We'll have the fields cleared and planted when you and Mother come next spring, Ralph promised. Crossing the Mississippi on a ferry boat had been thrilling and exciting. As the water swirled and left a barrier behind, Mary felt as though she were entering a new world. The new world was a wild country of unsettled woods. Now and then they came to a sparse settlement where a few log buildings huddled together. A scantily stocked store, blacksmith shop, and sometimes a primitive tavern. These settlements were usually located at the intersections of trade routes where fur trappers brought in their stores of winter pelts. As the wagons lurched along the rutted trail, Mary tried to dispel the uneasy feeling which had persisted all day. The words of the woodsmen in their frontier store seemed to take on new importance as the afternoon shadows darkened the woods. She took out her roll of knitting. Nancy had given her an ample supply of yarn. It will keep you company while the men are working in the woods, her mother had sensibly suggested. The clicking of the needles provided a welcome diversion through the woods, although the word Canucks continued its harassing refrain. She made up her mind to ask Uncle Clem at the first opportunity what the men were insinuating. Glancing at Uncle Clem, deep in his own reflections, despite the noise of the creaking wagons, convinced her that communication was out of the question until darkness would force them to make camp for the night. Tiring of her knitting, Mary opened the small valise at her side. She exchanged the knitting for a small wooden box. Lifting the cover, she let her fingers feel the contents. The strings of gay-colored beads, and the silver necklace with the crucifix that reflected the diminishing rays of the sun. Her mother had chided her good-naturedly when Mary had packed the wooden box in the valise. "Where will you wear those beads?" Mary smiled, removed the silver necklace from the box, and slipped it into her pocket. The touch of the crucifix seemed to provide a feeling of protection, a warmth that flowed through her whole body, making her momentarily forget her frustrations and fear of the morning's conversation. The flap of folded paper protruded from the side pocket of the valise. Removing the paper and unfolding it had become somewhat of a pleasant habit. Mary never tired of scanning the legal phrasing, her own name, and Ralph's at the bottom of the federal land grant affixed to her father's army discharge. Mary had good reason to remember the hesitation at the land office. The colonel in charge had looked sharply at the trio before him. "It's unheard of," he sputtered. "Neither of you of age. No telling what you will run into." Clem was shifting his weight, first to one foot and then to the other. He paused, cleared his throat to speak. The colonel centered his attention on Clem, hesitated for a moment's meditation, then continued. "Well, now that you've come this far, we'll have to stretch to a point," he finally conceded. Then had come an exciting study of a wall map. It appeared to Mary that it was all lakes. "Oh, please, sir," she had cried, "give us a claim by the lake." And so it had been arranged. A quarter section with a long shoreline was recorded for Peter. Making out the papers didn't require too much time. Mary well remembered the colonel's parting words as he handed her the papers. "Let us know how you get along. Send word if you need any help. Goodness knows how you'll manage." Returning the papers to the valise, Mary pondered the colonel's words and wondered whether he had been right. Their progress was slow. Frequently, Uncle Clem pulled in the impatient horses to allow the other wagon to catch up. Very often, he and Ralph were obliged to cut away the branches to let the wagons pass. Now, as they paused once more, the early evening appeared breathless in the dusky twilight. Uncle Clem took off his broad hat and wiped his sleeve across his face. He turned to Mary. "Ought to find a creek about here. Time to bed down for the night." Faintly in the rear, they could hear Ralph urging on the plodding oxen. A strange, wailing cry echoed through the trees. At regular intervals, it was repeated. A dawning, whining scream ending in a long, drawn-out wail. "Is it Indians?" Mary whispered, slipping from her seat and clutching Uncle Clem's arm. "No, honey. The Indians have all been chased out of these woods," he replied, stealing a furtive glance at the rifle that lay on the seat beside him. Again and again the chilling sound filled the air. It seemed ages before Ralph caught up with them. His face was set in youthful determination, a form of grim courage as he walked around to the side of the wagon. They huddled together and listened as the sound was repeated, growing fainter as though it were moving away in the distance. Another sound replaced the first. Mary and Ralph remained frightened, but Uncle Clem relaxed. "Whew, I'm plumb glad to hear it," he sighed, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his jacket. "Do you mean you know what makes that noise?" Ralph asked. "Reckon that's how I do. That's just a plain old sawmill, making that noise you're hearing now. I don't know about the other. Come to think of it, I wonder why the colonel didn't tell us about the sawmill being here." The wagons rolled forward once more in the direction of the metallic sound. It wasn't long before they emerged into a vast clearing. Great pyramided stacks of logs dominated the scene. Log shanties, scattered in a crude circle, fringed the background of trees. In the center of the clearing, a group of woodsmen were busy feeding immense logs to a giant circular saw. As Uncle Clem drew the team to a stop, the covered wagon became the center of interest. The huge saw whirred idly as the men forgot to feed in the next log. From the doorway of the largest of the shanties, a big man with a good-natured face came towards them. "Howdy, strangers. Welcome to camp. The name's Crandall. Most folks just call me Jim," he offered, extending a warm handshake. A half-hour later, Mary was tidying her hair in one of the shanties which had been given up for her use. Ralph and Uncle Clem waited in the doorway. "Better luck than we had a right to expect, finding this outfit when we had no idea of seeing white folks. Jim Crandall says they've been here for nearly a month, ever since the spring thaw began." Uncle Clem was slow in responding to Ralph's statement. He was looking at something suspended from a string over the doorway. "Garlic? I wonder if... Thunderation! It couldn't be." Mary stepped through the doorway before Ralph could press Uncle Clem for an explanation. Together, the two men flanked Mary and led the way to join the men of the camp in eating their evening meal. Under, the light of lanterns swung from overhead. They ate supper at a long table in an open shed. There was an enclosure at one end that served as a kitchen for the camp cook, a genial, red-faced man who tended an assortment of skillets and griddles on a makeshift stove, producing great stacks of griddle cakes, smoked sausages, and delicious brown beans. Mary was soon obliged to protest at the quantities of food urged upon her. Jim Crandall, seated by her side, regarded her with frank admiration for her courage. "I can't get over it," he declared. "A pretty young lady coming into this wilderness to stake a claim." He beckoned to the cook's helper, a slim youth who was carrying a huge platter of cakes around the table. "Over here, Chuck. Bring us some of your flapjacks." Chuck brought the platter of cakes to the table. "Mademoiselle, wish some?" The soft tone of his voice caused Mary to give him her full and immediate attention. He wore a fringed deerskin jacket instead of the heavy clothes worn by the others. His feet were clad in soft moccasins. After they'd all eaten, Mary was still watching him while he helped clear the big long table. He stood back in silence when Jim Crandall spread out a piece of brown paper and with the stub of a pencil began to draw a rough sketch of the region. "According to the description of your land claim, this just ought to be your location." The moccasin-clad feet moved a step forward. "Mr. Crandall, I have a map which should show the exact locality." Jim Crandall looked surprised as he accepted the neatly folded square of paper Chuck withdrew from the pocket of his jacket and extended to him. "That's so, Chuck. Just what we need." He unfolded the map and spread it in front of them on the table. "Even if it is from the Black Rapids Fur Company," he chuckled. Mary wondered at his inflection, but cast her doubt aside as she joined the others in following his finger, exploring the contents of the map. "Here's Lake Elysian. The lake is about 8 miles long, running due north and south. It looks like your section is about halfway up the west side." His stubby finger traced the shoreline. "See this bay, this fork of land pointing out into the lake? That's about where you're located." Mary was delighted. All this shoreline, what fun they'd have. Their old home in Wisconsin was many miles from the lake. Late into the night, she lay awake on the wide bunk, pleasantly conscious of the men outside huddled together around a blazing fire of brushwood. Finally, she dozed a little, only to wake up at the sound of voices close by. She recognized Crandall talking to Ralph and Uncle Clem. "Chuck will be just the help you need. He knows the woods and he can help you get your cabin started. He's only a Canuck, but he can guide you by the quickest route." All the peace and quiet Mary had experienced vanished with those words. She found herself trembling with fear. Only a Canuck revived the ominous warning she'd heard that morning. Settlers not welcome. Uneasily, she fell asleep.